The B-side presidents, part 3. Today's topic of discussion is William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was the 9th president of the United States. He is most notable for have served the shortest time in office. He only served 30 days as president. That's because when he was making his inauguration speech, which was over 8,000 words and lasted over 2 hours, he did not use a coat. He wanted to prove that he was young, vigorous, youthful. Because of that, he contracted pneumonia and subsequently passed away. He was the first president while in office to pass away. That's why when John Tyler, his successor, took over, there was no precedent. There was no clear successor plan in place on what to do when the president was unalived while in office. He will be the topic of discussion in my next video. This statement that I read about Harrison accurately describes his life. Besides catching pneumonia during his inauguration, Harrison is famous for things he didn't actually do. He didn't win a big military victory at Tippecanoe. It was a minor fight against an outnumbered village of Indians. And because Harrison screwed up the defense of his camp, the white Americans suffered most of the casualties. He did better during the War of 1812. But his real impact on history, arguably, came from the work he did in the Grassland years. That's his homestead. Acquiring several states worth of territory from the Indians in deals that cost the federal government only pennies per acre. A large reason that Harrison is forgotten is not just because he only served 30 days in office. That's the main reason. Another caveat is that he was in a time period of forgotten presidents. Presidents are always victims of their time. The reason FDR is considered a great president, I don't think he was, that's my humble opinion, is because he was president during the Great Depression and then during WW2. If you look at the unemployment rate before he enacted his New Deal programs, it was actually falling more precipitously than after he enacted the New Deal programs. His policies did nothing to improve the economic situation. But because he was president during that time, he was considered a great president. And by many historians, he's ranked as the 4th or 5th best president, sometimes even the 3rd. William Henry Harrison, because he believed in things such as manifest destiny, acquiring territory from the Indians, that's another reason he's not remembered. This is not a time period of history that is celebrated, that is considered iconic. Even extremely successful presidents during that time, such as James K. Polk, who I will make a video on in the series in the future, who had many legislative achievements as president, still is not considered by many people as remarkable. It was more complicated as well. I'll just go on a quick little rant and then I'll get back to the video. There wasn't one single unified Indian tribe. There wasn't one single unified group. No one said they owned the land. There were a couple times you had the Iroquois Confederacy who connected 6 Indian tribes and they allied with the British during the French and Indian War. Tecumseh, during the Battle of Tippecanoe, he wanted to create a confederation of natives. He wanted them to all come together and own the land and things of that nature. But you had different Native American tribes, the Cherokees, the Creeks, and those are the English names that we refer to them as. If you were to go back in a time machine, they had all kinds of different names. They spoke different languages. They had different allegiances. The Spaniards, when they came here with Columbus, some of the native tribes allied with the Spaniards because they were fighting other tribes. This idea that the natives were smoking peace pipes, living in harmony with nature, it's just not accurate. Every piece of land today has been conquered multiple times over. This whole idea about, oh, the United States is bad because they did this. Don't get me wrong, it's bad what they did. I think any normal human being can agree who is intellectually honest. But to castigate and say, only the United States did this, just would not be accurate. But as the saying goes, the victor gets the spoils, and the person who gets the spoils is considered most culpable. When Ohio headed towards statehood, and at this time it was called the Ohio Territory, Henry's presence in Congress made it easier to figure out who should run the new Indian Territory, which would consist of the land the United States controlled to Ohio's west. The president at the time, John Quincy Adams, with the approval of Congress, made Harrison the first governor of the territory, which included most of what are now the states of Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And the reason that he kept moving up when it came to politics was not because he was a principled individual with many legislative ambitions. Rather, he had 9 children, he had his homestead, he had his small, modest farm. He wanted a better salary so he could provide for his family. He tried some business ventures, such as investing in whiskey distilleries and other things, but he was not known for his business acumen. He saw, like many prominent men at the time, he could use the myth of him being a great war hero at Tippecanoe. He could leverage that to upward mobility, and then he himself could make more money when it came to political positions. Harrison became a prodigious signer of treaties. The territory, when he arrived as governor, was a series of small strips along the Ohio River. Between 1802 and 1805, he acquired what is now the southern part of Indiana, most of Illinois, and parts of Wisconsin and Missouri. Harrison signed 7 treaties in all, and he later estimated that he had acquired about 50 million acres of land at a price of less than 2 cents per acre when he was done. He had basically accomplished what the federal government thought at the time was its ultimate goal, pushing the Indian Territory beyond the Mississippi River. Now, the difficult part about this, as I stated, they made a deal with one native tribe. You typically had Indian ambassadors that worked for the government. They would negotiate with the tribes. They would give them whiskey, try to get them inebriated, give them cigars, deer skins, and things of that nature. Give them a few stipulations, and then they would take some of the land. But then other natives who were not in on the deal, they themselves did not think that it was legitimate. And that was really the cause of a lot of strife between the individual sides. what William Henry Harrison is really famous for is really his election. What's interesting is how his supporters framed reality. The only truth that matters is the truth that you're told. The truth of the matter was Martin Van Buren, who was the incumbent president who was running for re-election at the time, he actually had a modest upbringing. He was the son of a very non-successful tavern owner. He spoke Dutch, and he had very little formal education. Harrison, on the other hand, had private tutors. He grew up on a plantation. He was taught different languages by his private tutor. But that's not what was perceived during the election. During the election, people would talk about hard cider and how William Henry Harrison grew up in a cabin. His campaign slogan became Tippecanoe and Tyler too. John Tyler was his vice president. Tippecanoe was the battle that he embellished, where he built up his mythical reputation of being a war hero. People perceived William Henry Harrison as the farmer, the laborer, the mechanic, the layman's, everyday man's candidate who grew up with modest, humble beginnings in a log cabin. And that wasn't the case. They viewed Van Buren as the elitist establishment figure, even though he himself, although he had been in politics for a long time, he was instrumental in working as the little magician, they called him, to get Andrew Jackson elected. His upbringing was a lot more modest and humble. In Philadelphia, a distiller named E.G. Booze created an election souvenir of whiskey in log cabin bottles, which helped popularize the word booze as a synonym for alcohol. The roots of booze are complicated and wind all the way back to 14th century Dutch and Middle East. But the Harrison campaign seems to have made it all part of the American lexicon. You had all these different things people would buy. You had Harrison and Tyler ties. You had anecdotes from the log cabin that talked about growing up as a humble man in a log cabin, whiskey, all these different souvenirs. This was really the first entertainment style political election at the time. The majority of people who voted were not voting on the issues. The talk about tariffs, the talk about what they were going to do in foreign policy was not widely discussed. It was more entertainment. It was more of an excuse to drink, be out in the community. And during this time, you didn't have large sporting events. You didn't have large concerts. You didn't have large gatherings. So imagine going to these rallies, listening to these individuals speaking enthusiastically, drinking the hard cider, and we're going to be the elitist Martin Van Buren. And they called him Martin Van Ruin at the time because the economy was going down. And that wasn't Martin Van Buren's fault. It had to do with the banks being gone and a bunch of state banks. It's a complicated economic issue. But the point is, people perceived Martin Van Ruin as the elitist and William Henry Harrison as the common man's candidate. And like Andrew Jackson, that's who they supported. The only thing he really talked about policy-wise is that he was going to defer a lot to Congress. As the candidate for the Whigs, that's pretty much all he really talked about. He talked about internal improvements, but he was very ambiguous. He was very vague on his political positions. A big issue, a big negative for Harrison at the time was his age. He was 68 years old when the average life expectancy for a man was 40 years old. Because of his age, People perceived him to be old, feeble, weak, incapable of performing the functions of the presidency. Eventually, the Whigs asked Harrison's doctor to issue a public report on his fitness. Another first that would, unfortunately, not become routine until late in the 20th century. Harrison's doctors declared that he was surprised by the general's vivacity, youthfulness of feelings. His intellect is unimpaired, bodily vigor as good as that of most men his age, subject to no disease but periodic headaches. Harrison's speech-making was partly an attempt to further demonstrate his fitness. Another interesting part of the campaign, during that time it was considered rude, it was considered unceremonious for people seeking higher office to go campaign on their behalf. They would just stay in their home and let their cohorts, let their advisors, let their individuals who supported them in the party do the campaigning. But Harrison made speeches himself. And a big reason for this was to prove that he was vigorous, that he was like a spring chicken, because being 68 during that time was considered extremely old. The election, the turnout was 80.2%, an astonishing increase from 58% in 1836, which was 4 years earlier. This was the 1840 election. Van Buren had received almost 400,000 more votes in 1840 than he had as the victor in 1836. Now we get to the main event that Harrison is famous for. His inauguration speech is the longest in U.S. history, around 8,445 words. That took nearly 2 hours to deliver. The average inauguration speech is 2,300 words and lasts 20 to 30 minutes. The story goes, Harrison wanted to prove that he was vigorous, he was a spring chicken, he could handle making long speeches. He did not wear his coat to prove that he was strong and up to the task of being president. After that, he contracted pneumonia and then subsequently passed away, and then John Tyler became president. And it wasn't that fast or that simplistic. I'm going to get more into how all this took place, the optics of it, the journey, and the cavilling that was going on during that time. Because there was no precedent on what to do when the president passed away in office. This was the first time. It is, in my opinion, based on the research I've done, this singular event definitely was the straw that broke the camel's back. But there were other things that should have been culpable in this. Harrison, right when he was elected, he was bombarded with office seekers. The presidents during that time used to have individuals who wanted to work for them directly hand them their resumes, speak to them, and try to get jobs. That's why Charles Guiteau unalived Garfield. He wanted to work in his administration. He went to the White House directly and tried to work for the president. He was bombarded with office seekers, and also he overstressed himself as an older man. There were also reports that he was walking around without a coat on. He went to the only bookstore in Washington, D.C., purchased a Bible for the White House. He was constantly at dinners. He was constantly shaking hands. And there were reports that he got so tired of shaking hands that his hand became stiff. I'm not saying that the long inauguration and the speech and him not wearing a coat did not ultimately lead to the death knell. But I am simply stating that that single domino that fell was just one instance of the inevitable. I think if he would have lived longer than that, I don't think he would have lasted his entire administration because of his age, because of the stress it put on his heart, the stress of being the president.